Let's look at the deduction of TDS from payment under development agreement, which is referred to in section 45, subsection 5A, and the TDS has to be deducted under section 194IC. Now in these cases, what happens is that if suppose an individual owns a piece of land or a building, or maybe both of them, this individual may give this to a builder who will construct maybe a house or a flat or a floor on it, and he sells it. Now he may give some flat to the individual, and in addition to flat he may also give cash to such individual. The question which arises is, what is the TDS liability under section 194IC which arises on such a transaction? So the issues we are going to cover in respect of these sections are: who are the person who are liable to deduct TDS under section 194IC? Who should be the recipient? Second is the payment which is being made covered under section 45 subsection 5A? What is the rate at which tax has to be deducted? What is the time when the tax has to be deducted? So, like in every other case of section which we saw, the parties involved can be the payer and the recipient. The payer, if he is a resident, he is covered under section 194IC. If he is a non-resident, even then he is covered under section 194IC. The recipient, if he is a resident who is an individual or HUF, he is covered under section 194IC. But a resident who is other than an individual or an HUF is not covered under section 194IC. Similarly, a non-resident is also not covered if he receives any consideration which is referred to in section 194IC. So what does this section read? It says that any person will include a resident and a non-resident, responsible for paying to a resident. So the recipient should be a resident. If he's a non-resident, this section is not applicable. And even if he's a resident, he should be an individual or HUF only. Any sum by way of consideration, not being consideration in kind, under an agreement referred to in section 45 subsection 5A, shall at the time of credit of such sum to the account of the transferor, or at the time of payment thereof, in cash, cheque or draft or any other mode whichever is earlier, deduct an amount equal to 10%. So the rate of TDS is 10%. The person who's making the payment has to deduct tax, and the consideration should not be in kind. What this means we are going to look at a little later. So what is the meaning of specified agreement? So there can be an individual who allows the developer to develop land or building or both. And as a consideration, the developer gives part of the share in constructed property. So section 45(5)(a) refers to a specified agreement between an individual or HUF, which is here, and the developer, whereby a person owning land or building or both, so who's the owner? The individual or HUF, agree to allow another person, who's the another person? Developer, to develop a real estate project on such land or building or both, in consideration of a share being land or building or both in such a project, whether with or without payment of part of the consideration in cash. The agreement may be only to give property. The agreement may be to give property plus some part in cash. Both of them are covered under a specified agreement. And what specified agreement says is that the individual or HUF is going to allow the developer to construct property on a land or a building or both which is owned by such individual, and in return gets a part of the share in the constructed property either with or without cash. What is the rate of TDS? The rate of TDS is 10% of the sum by way of consideration and 20% if PAN is not provided by the recipient. The tax has to be deducted at the time of credit or payment, whichever is earlier. But the credit of tax deducted under Section 194 IC can be claimed by the assessee who's an individual or HUF in the year of taxability of capital gain in his hands. That is, the year in which the certificate of completion is issued by the competent authority. So basically in such cases where the individual would have actually, let me just go back to the previous slide. In this case, suppose the individual gave the possession of land or building in 2016. The developer constructed everything and the completion certificate was, let's say, given on 1/6/2018. Now the developer is under an obligation to deduct tax at the time of credit or payment, whichever is earlier. So suppose he deducted TDS in 2016, but the certificate of completion was received in 1/6/2018. In this case, the capital gains tax liability may arise in the hands of the individual during financial year 18-19. So even though TDS was deducted in 16, the credit for that will be available in the year when it is taxable in the hands of the individual or HUF, which is when the certificate of completion is received by the developer. This is what was indicated in this slide. Let's look at TDS on compensation for the acquisition of certain immovable property. Section 194 LA. So what are the issues? Who's the deductor? Who's the recipient? What are the payments covered under this section? What's the minimum threshold below which TDS is not required to be deducted? When is TDS required to be deducted? And when the exemptions are available? So the parties involved in the transaction are basically a resident and a non-resident who could be a payer or a recipient. If the payer is a resident, he is covered under section 194 LA. Even when he is a non-resident, he is covered under this section. But if the recipient is a resident, only then he is covered under section 194 LA. If the recipient is a non-resident, then he is not covered under section 194 LA. So what does this section say? It says that any person, whether a resident or a non-resident, responsible for paying on or after 1/10/2004 to a resident, the recipient has to be a resident. Any sum in the nature of compensation or enhanced compensation or the consideration or the enhanced consideration on account of compulsory acquisition of any immovable property other than agricultural land under any law for the time being in force shall deduct an amount equal to 10%. So if any authority acquires compulsory land from an individual, right, the compensation which is paid to the individual or any enhanced compensation for such an acquisition will be liable for deduction of TDS at the rate of 10%. So the rate of TDS is 10%. If the PAN is not provided, then as per section 206 AA, it will be 20%. And if there is any lower withholding tax certificate which is obtained under section 197, then the rate will be as per that certificate. The TDS has to be deducted when the payment exceeds 2,50,000 during the financial year. If it is less than this amount, then there is no requirement to deduct TDS. What is the timing and the rate? The TDS at 10% has to be deducted at the time of payment. Now this is important. It's not in the year of acquisition, but it's the year when the payment is made for compulsory acquisition. So if the acquisition was done in 16-17, but the payment was done in 2018-19, then TDS has to be deducted at the time of payment. There is no surcharge, health or education cess, which has to be added to the rate of 10%. Now, which payments are exempt under section 194 LA? 1. If the payment is equal to or less than 250,000 during the financial year. So it has to be 2,50,000 plus. And if the payment is exempted from income tax under section 96 of the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013. So if these two cases are the ones which you are referring to, there is no requirement to deduct TDS under section 194 LA. Let's look at a few problems. Compensation for compulsory acquisition of agricultural land is 2,30,000. What is the TDS? Now, if the payment is less than 2,50,000, there is no requirement to deduct TDS under this section. So, irrespective of whether it's an agricultural land or otherwise, given that the amount itself is less than 250, there is no need to deduct TDS here. Compensation for acquisition of land and building, 3 lakh. Yes, it exceeds 2,50,000. It is paid. Therefore, tax at 10% or 30,000 will be deducted from such payment. We have assumed that the PAN number is available. Compensation due for compulsory acquisition of land in 2021 accrued now. So basically there's an accrual of compensation which is going to be due in future year, but it has been accrued in the books of accounts. Since the TDS has to be deducted at the time of payment, accrual will not carry any significance and therefore there will be no TDS which will be deducted even though the accrued amount is 23 lakh. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, you can subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more such videos. You can like this videos and also share it with your friends. And if you're looking for material on this particular subject, you can visit us on our website at www.arinjayacademy.com.